Good morning. Thank you. My name is Ryan Paul, and I teach history here on campus, and I'm also the director of A.P.E.X. And on behalf of myself and the A.P.E.X. team, Amelia Nauman and Sophie Javage, I want to welcome you to the Great Hall, first of all, and more importantly, to Saving Yellowstone, the creation of a national icon. I'd also like to thank the generous donors to the Paul Patrick Dubon Memorial Fund for the promotion of national parks, the Eccles Visiting Scholar Fund, and the Provost's Office for making this event possible. I'd like to remind you that today's conversation will continue this afternoon at 3 p.m. on Thunder 91 and on the A.P.E.X. Radio Hour podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts from. Megan Kate Nelson comes to the A.P.E.X. stage to share her insights and research on the history of one of America's most incredible gems, Yellowstone National Park. Her lecture, Saving Yellowstone, the Creation of a National Icon, will cover her findings of her most recent book. She published Saving Yellowstone, Exploration and Preservation in Reconstruction America this year on the 150th anniversary of the Yellowstone Act, which created the first national park in the world. Nelson is an expert on the history of the American Civil War, the U.S. West, and popular culture. This past year, she was elected as a Fellow of the Society of American Historians. She has written articles about topics that she's familiar with for the New York Times, Washington Post, Time, The Atlantic, Smithsonian Magazine, Preservation Magazine, and Civil War Times. Nelson is also the author of The Three-Cornered War, The Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the Fight for the West, which was a finalist for the 2021 Pulitzer Prize in History. That's a cue to applaud. There you go. The Pulitzer Prize. And by the way, we have copies of both Saving Yellowstone and Three-Cornered War out in the lobby for purchase. And after the presentation today, Dr. Nelson will be happy to host a book signing out there if you're interested. And I would strongly suggest that you pick those up if you get a chance. Before leaving academia to write full-time in 2014, Dr. Nelson taught U.S. history and American studies at Texas Tech University, Cal State Fullerton, Harvard, and Brown. She earned her BA in history and literature from Harvard University and her PhD in American studies from the University of Iowa. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Megan Kate Nelson to Southern Utah University and the A.P.E.X. stage.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction, Ryan. I think most of you probably know Ryan, but I just met him the other day and have been super impressed. He is a total superstar and an amazing person and a great leader for this lecture series. So thank you for everything that you have done organizing this trip for me and squiring me around. Thank you also to Laura Davis, who suggested me in the first place. And to Amelia and to Sophie, who have been so great in helping me get oriented to the campus and to help me get ready for this great event. So, and thank you all for being here in the middle of your day. Saving Yellowstone really is a book project that came out of my previous book. This is how I usually do things. I'm finishing one book and then thinking about what comes next and getting inspired by certain things. And they're connected in many ways. Saving Yellowstone is in some ways a sequel. The idea, of course, came from the Three-Cornered War, from my research into a protagonist in that book named John Clark, who is the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory. So I became interested then in surveying and the history of surveying and was reminded of the Hayden survey of Yellowstone in 1871, and then thought, wait a minute, the 150th is coming up. That would be a good time to write a book about this survey and the Yellowstone Act. As you'll see in the course of this talk, there were events in the Far West during the Civil War that I talk about in Three Cornered that made the events that I describe in Saving Yellowstone possible. And just as the Three Cornered War asks, what happens if we look at the Civil War from the Far West? Saving Yellowstone asks, what if we look at Reconstruction from Yellowstone? All this is going on in 1871 and 72, right in the middle of the Reconstruction era. Does this change our understanding of that period and its significance in our American history? And does it change the way that we see Yellowstone and its significance at this moment and as an iconic American landscape? I often am asked the question, where did the book come from? And that is certainly one answer. Another answer is that I am from the West originally. I'm in Boston now, but I grew up in Colorado. I first went to Yellowstone when I was 10 years old with my family on a summer driving vacation. And as much as I and my extremely annoying older brother complained about these trips when they were happening, they actually did kind of start me on the road, if you will, to being a historian of landscapes. Because by the time I went to college, I had been to 45 of the 50 states in a meaningful way. In the car, looking at the landscape, we didn't have any, screens to look at, so we looked out the window. And we were constantly going to places and seeing their significance and pulling off. My dad would, kind of screech over to the side of the road anytime he saw a historical marker. So this really started me on the path to considering all of the landscapes in America and why we love them, why we find them strange, and why we think they might be particularly national in character. So I had not been back to Yellowstone since 1982. And I thought this would be, a great research project to do because then I can go and visit Yellowstone, of course. And so I started to write the book in the summer of 2019. I was doing kind of preliminary research. I had several research trips planned and was in the middle of the first one to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, looking at all of Hayden's reports for the expedition. Because it was a federally funded effort, he was required to turn in all of his documentation to the federal government, which the National Archives now owns. So I was there looking at these, and you'll see some of these documents. There's an example, this letter here on the left from William Henry Dawes telling Hayden that he was super busy at the beginning of the session and they'd have to reschedule their meeting to talk with one another. In the middle of that trip, the archivist stopped by and kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You may want to, get pictures of everything you need because we are closing down on Friday for this COVID thing. And, it's probably only going to be in like 2 weeks, so, you can come back later." 2.5 years later, the National Archives reopened. So I ended up researching and writing all the rest of Saving Yellowstone, about 80% of the book, a book about travel and exploration from my own living room, and sometimes from the kitchen island. So that was an interesting experience, and I'm eternally grateful to all of the library staff members who have digitized records, because I was able to access a really amazing amount of material for this book from digitized resources. And I put a list of primary resources here for you so you could see the kinds of things that I was looking at. Because I'm an interdisciplinary historian with a degree in American Studies, I try to look at as many possible sources as I can. Print, manuscript, material, visual. So I was looking at all kinds of things to try and tell me what was going on in 1871-72, why Yellowstone kind of seemed to suddenly burst into the American imagination, and why a U.S. Congress that was kind of still really embroiled in bringing the country back together would even care about preserving this place in a really hard to reach part of the United States. I was finally able to go back to Yellowstone this time last year. So this is a picture of me on a bridge over the Yellowstone River north of the park. And that was great. And I actually did have time to make some rather vital edits to the manuscript where I had been wrong about a couple of things just reading the sources. And so it's always really important to me as a landscape historian and environmental historian to actually go to the places that I'm writing about. If you read Three Cornered or Saving Yellowstone, you'll see that I'm putting the reader on the ground with people in the past. And part of that is giving you a really rich sense of the landscape and the surroundings. You know, what trees are growing, what does it look like, what is the weather like? So it's important for me to actually go to these places and experience them myself in order to bring that landscape alive, really, for readers. So ultimately, the book has a couple of interconnected stories. Saving Yellowstone is the story of scientific study and exploration. It is also the story of capitalism, particularly big railroads. It is the story of indigenous sovereignty and persistence, and then also the expansion of federal power, which is one of the major themes of both Reconstruction history and the history of the U.S. West. So undoubtedly, you know, you all, as this is the University of the Parks, and because you live in this region, probably know more than most that Yellowstone was not, in fact, created by Teddy Roosevelt in the 20th century, which is what most Americans, I think, believe, but in fact created in 1872 in the middle of Reconstruction and signed into being by Ulysses S. Grant. Grant had become president in 1868 during a time of some real post-war chaos. Republicans held huge majorities in the House and the Senate as the former Confederate states came back into Congress. Grant, like most moderate Republicans in this period and radical Republicans, really believed in the power of the federal government to protect and provide for citizens. He was intent on making good on the Civil War's aims. He had been good friends with Abraham Lincoln. He believed in his vision for a post-war world, one that recognized the rights and the freedoms of all Americans, particularly the newly freed 4 million men and women living across the American South. His campaign slogan, as you can see on this commemorative handkerchief, was "Let us have peace." And for him, and for most Americans, that meant peace between the North and the South. But Grant also believed that this particular slogan applied to the West. Grant supported and pursued in the South, in kind of pursuit of this goal of peace, the prosecution of members of the Ku Klux Klan, who had begun to emerge in 1868 and engage in campaigns of terror and violence across the South to prevent Black people from exercising their newly given 14th and 15th Amendment rights. He really saw white supremacists across the South as rebels, as the kind of second phase of the Confederate rebellion against the US government. And so this is one of these interesting moments in the Grant presidency where he is acting a little bit more like a military general and a little bit less like a president, really. South Carolina, which had been the cradle of secession, became the first theater of his war against the KKK. In October of 1871, just as Ferdinand Hayden was coming back from his exploration of Yellowstone, Grant suspended the writ of habeas corpus in multiple counties in South Carolina so that U.S. Army officials that were posted there could arrest Klan members and keep them imprisoned until their trials. In November and December of 1871, those trials began in South Carolina. And in the end, the US government was actually able to successfully prosecute and convict hundreds of Klan members, most of them the rank and file, for conspiracy to prevent Black Americans from exercising their civil rights. This was an unprecedented act of federal power used to protect the rights of citizens, who were not being protected by their state governments. This caused a great deal of consternation among the Democratic Party and then also among white Southerners in many cases. And it was really, unfortunately, a kind of short-lived project. But there is this theme here, not only of providing for citizens, but also using federal government power to do it. And this is what we see also in the West during this period. So Grant initially supported treaty negotiations with Native peoples, continuing the work of an 1868 peace commission, which had gone out under actually the Johnson administration, with the goal of negotiating peace treaties between all of the Plains tribes and the US government. And this was meant to clear the way for the Transcontinental Railroad, which was just being built, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. But in 1871, in the same session in which the US Congress gave Ferdinand Hayden $40,000 to explore Yellowstone, the Congress passed a rider to an Indian Appropriations Act, which is where they're raising the money to send to reservations and Indian agents, most of them in the West, putting an end to treaty negotiations. So this rider basically said that from that point on, the federal government would only make peace agreements and not treaties. And this was an important distinction because treaties recognize the sovereignty of Native people. Peace agreements do not. And so this kind of marked the beginning of the US government exerting its military power in the West. Instead of initially negotiating treaties, military action became the first action in pursuit of an Indian policy. And Grant increasingly was on board with this, especially in the 1870s in regard to the Lakota peoples under Sitting Bull, as we will see. So informing all of these actions in the West were a couple of other developments. I just mentioned the Transcontinental Railroad, which was enabled by Civil War legislation passed in 1862 and 1864 and was completed in 1869. This railroad line, of course, I imagine many of you know it well. It provided rapid transportation for migrants and for US Army troops, and it suggested that the East and the West were finally connected with an iron clasp. This was the term that a lot of Americans were using at this moment. Also, the Great Surveys. Geographical surveys had been American projects since Lewis and Clark set out in 1803, 1804. They were funded by the federal government. They were staffed by scientists, usually led up until the 1860s by military officers, but increasingly by scientists and other civilians, although they continued to be protected by military details. So the US Army was still very much involved in these great surveys. And the intent was to create knowledge, on the one hand, to determine the contours and the natural resources of the lands west of the Mississippi, but also mostly to kind of provide information about how Americans could use these lands for future development. Could they be farmed? Could they be branched? Could they be mined? How could we possibly use these places to make America more productive? So these surveys were really engines of conquest and provided for the white settlement of the West. They were not, in this period, focused on land preservation. So this is an important thing to note. This was never really their goal. There was also emerging in this period a kind of cultural project. The United States, in the years after the war, was a nation in search of events and images that would bring them together in the wake of this really destructive civil war. So there was emerging in this period a belief and an idea called nature's nation, that the United States had spectacular, unique landscapes that really proved how great the nation was, right? We may not have the ruins of ancient European civilizations, but we had Niagara Falls, we had Yosemite, right? and this made us unique in all the world. So surveyors were also setting out to find these and to document them in words and images for the American public. So Saving Yellowstone tells the stories of this process and really focuses on three men who staked their claims to Yellowstone and the Yellowstone River Valley in this period. The first major protagonist, as you might imagine, was Ferdinand Hayden. Born into poverty in New England, he was a child of divorce. Unlike many scientists of the period who were born into elite families, Hayden really lived a pretty hard scrabble life, and it made him very scrappy. And he was ambitious, he was competitive. From all accounts, you either really loved Hayden or you really did not like Hayden. He was that kind of personality. He ended up at Oberlin College, where he discovered a real love of natural history and a talent for fossil collecting. He loved to be in the field. He had a real eye for fossils. He could look at an outcropping and just find them and understand their importance. He also, interestingly, was a very fast walker. And so he could collect these just prodigious amounts of fossils and then bring them back to the East Coast to sell to scientists. Soon, though, he decided he wasn't really, happy with just doing that. And so he pursued a degree. If you wanted to be a geologist or a scientist in this period, you went to medical school. So he went to medical school, he got a degree, and he decided that what he really wanted to be was the nation's foremost scientist explorer. This whole plan for himself was interrupted by the Civil War. He quite reluctantly served as an army surgeon. He was actually kind of angry that he was diverted from his scientific studies, wasn't really kind of waving the patriotic flag. But he served in South Carolina and then in the Army of the Shenandoah. And when he mustered out, he went back to scientific exploring and ultimately led the scientific survey of Nebraska. And he was the first of civilian leaders of these surveys, and really was quite responsible for shaping a lot of what we know of today as part of USGS survey expeditions and popular science writing. So at this point, in 1870-71, Yellowstone was one of the few unmapped places on the continent, sort of unknown by most white Americans. There had been rumors. Scouts and fur traders had been there, had come back with these what seemed like completely insane stories, right? Of like mud exploding out of the ground and glass cliffs, and everyone was like, sure, right, like you've been hitting the bottle a little hard there. And no one really believed them. But Montana Territory, which had grown by leaps and bounds due to a gold rush in 1863, was kind of growing, and there were some civil officials there who were really interested in Yellowstone and what it could do for them as a territory. And so in 1869 and 1870, some civilians, some amateurs, entered Yellowstone. And the 1870 expedition, led by Nathaniel Langford, became quite spectacular. He wrote a piece for Scribner's Monthly about it. The most important part of that survey was that they actually lost a guy named Truman Everts. And he got lost in the wilderness of Yellowstone for 37 days. And when they found him, he was almost dead. But this was a spectacular story, also published in Scribner's Monthly and kind of tracked in the nation through the newspapers. And so people were kind of paying more attention to Yellowstone, and Hayden was like, I need to get there, or someone's going to get there first, and I want to be the one. So he lobbied Congress. They gave him $40,000 in March of 1871, and he started to put together his survey team. Again, the goal was to explore Yellowstone, to map it, to understand it, not to preserve it. And also, again, for Hayden, his goal was to establish himself as the nation's foremost scientist explorer. He had help from a lot of different federal entities, so here's how we see federal power expanding into the West in a new way. He had money from Congress, obviously. He had orders from the Department of the Interior. He had support from the Smithsonian Institution. He also secured kind of lower rates and free passes from the Union Pacific Railroad. He could not have gone to Yellowstone without the Transcontinental. This was key, to be able to get to Yellowstone quickly, because as you all likely know, the visitation window in Yellowstone is quite narrow. You really have to get there after mid-May, and you have to get out of there by mid-September if you don't want to be snowed in. And to be snowed in Yellowstone in 1871 it meant pretty much certain death. So you did not want to be there. They did not have much time. And so the Transcontinental enabled the team to go from Omaha to Ogden within a week, and then they were able to set out with their wagons north and kind of move up through Idaho into Bozeman, across Virginia City, and then down across the mountains and into what we now know of as kind of Livingston, Gardner, Thoroughfare Valley, and into the northern entrance of Yellowstone. He also had the support of the U.S. military. He got supplies at forts along the way, including, most importantly, hardy Western horses and mules. And he also secured a protective detail of the 2nd Cavalry from Fort Ellis in Bozeman. There was also an Army Corps of Engineers group that was out there to survey as well, and they came along for the ride. Along the route, expedition members purchased supplies at established depots like Salt Lake City, Virginia City, and then also Bottler's Ranch, which was a ranch owned by a couple of German brothers right there. And so, they had this idea that they were going into the wilderness, but they kept running into people. They were like, oh, hey, you've actually lived here for a while. There were a lot of Mormon farmers and ranchers along the route who were providing them with eggs and milk, which they greatly appreciated. So yes, this was not an empty space in any respect. So Hayden's team was full of scientists, packers, hunters. He had a group of what were called the political boys, who were the sons of Republican congressmen and senators who had given him money, so he needed to take them along as a favor to his patrons. And then he also hired on, really the first person he brought along was the team member he thought was the most valuable one, which was Potato John Raymond, who was the cook. So although he never acknowledged it also, there was sort of one other group that kind of helped him in this survey, and those were indigenous communities who had pounded out pathways through Yellowstone for hundreds of years. And it's funny, you read his reports, he never really acknowledged that, but he was like, we're the first people to be here. And then we followed the trail up the side of the White Mountain. You're like, yeah, who made that trail, man? Let's discuss. So Hayden, even though he had that particular blind spot, had a couple of great talents that made him an excellent expedition leader. First of all, he was a great team leader, a great manager. He allowed the men, especially the scientists in his group, to create their own collecting teams. He gave them instructions and then just let them go. And they did their own thing. They lived with who they wanted, and then went off and collected and then came back. And he expected them to work hard, but he did not crack down on them at all, which they greatly appreciated. He was also a really good writer, and this was really important for his field because he needed to, at the end of every expedition, write a series of reports. Some of them scientific, some of them meant for politicians, right? So he understood the power of language, of travel narratives in particular. If any of you are fans of popular science writing, it was Hayden who really was one of the first people to write in that genre in this period of American history, to really bring science to the people. He also understood the power of visual images, and in every survey he led, he brought illustrators and painters and photographers along. William Henry Jackson was also one of the first people he recruited for this expedition. Jackson had grown up in Vermont, and he took to photography sort of in the same way as Hayden had taken to fossil hunting. He had a real talent for it, and he really loved it. Again, his work as a photographer, like Hayden's work as a scientist, was interrupted by the Civil War. He served in a Vermont company as a private, and after he mustered out, he went west with a wagon train in the late 1860s. And then he started a photography studio when he came on his way back in Omaha. In 1869, he got a really big commission from the Union Pacific Line, which hired him to take pictures all along the railroad track. So he was taking landscape shots, he was taking shots of the tracks and the bridges that the engineers had built. And he was in Cheyenne, Wyoming, as part of this project when he met Ferdinand Hayden for the first time. And they met in a place that I will not divulge. You'll have to read the book to find out the conditions of their first meeting. But he had joined Hayden in his 1870 survey of southern Wyoming, and so Hayden invited him along to Yellowstone the next year. And photography in this period, you know, it was really only invented and really taken up in the 1850s. And the Civil War accelerated that technological innovation, and Americans began to expect to see photographic images of various lands across the nation. And what they provided for Hayden not only was a visual image that could be a little more persuasive maybe than the written word or scientific detail, especially for politicians, but they also were kind of proof, right, that they were there and these things actually existed. This is the way that photographs work for us when we go to national parks, right? We take selfies, we take pictures of the landscape, we post them, and we're like, we were there, right? So this was an important part, and he completely understood the power of these images. So you can see kind of two of his images here. Here's Bottler's Ranch on the top, and then what they called the White Mountain, which was then renamed Mammoth Hot Springs. But Jackson was working quite closely with the other artist that I'm going to mention here in a minute, Thomas Moran, a painter. And so that's Moran. He sent him out there on the structure of Mammoth Hot Springs because he wanted a figure for scale, right? So often I think about how close we came to losing Thomas Moran, who could have fallen through at any moment and somehow did not. So here he is. Thomas Moran was from an immigrant family. He was from England. He had come to the United States as a child, grown up in Philadelphia. And by 1871, he was already making a name for himself as a landscape painter. And he was also working as an illustrator, woodcut illustrator for Scribner's magazine. So he had done the illustrations for the articles that had already come out about Yellowstone. And he had come to the attention of the Philadelphia investment banker Jay Cook, who I will also talk about in a second in more detail. And Cook wanted Moran to go along on this Yellowstone expedition to paint him some images, some paintings of Yellowstone itself, and then also to provide some images he could use in his advertising for the Northern Pacific Railroad. So Moran came along, he joined them about halfway in mid-July, and then became fast friends with Jackson, and they worked together a lot as they were moving through the Yellowstone landscape. So he did a lot of watercolors, like the ones that you see here, but really he was focused, once he saw the lower falls of the Yellowstone and that canyon, he knew he had an epic, iconic landscape painting on his hands. And so he actually left the survey as quickly as possible after that point so that he could start painting what he called his big picture. And I just want to talk a little bit about the delight of looking at original sources for a second, especially in light of this. So this is one of the manuscripts that I was able to look at in my 1 week at the National Archives. This is Thomas Moran's letter to Ferdinand Hayden in March of 1872. So this is actually after the passage of the Yellowstone Act. He's painting his big painting, and what he says here in the middle of the letter is, I'm painting this image, and I would really like to include you in it, but I need you to send me a photograph of yourself, right? And this letter has been transcribed, and we have it in various things, but what you don't get in the transcription is that he says, and the picture should be about this size, and he includes this little sketch, which is supposed to be Hayden in his hat with his beard, with a coat on, with his hand in his pocket. And he says, I just need your like head and shoulders about this size, right? Because he wanted to put figures in the landscape painting. This is very common as part of the landscape tradition. And just to show you what resulted from this, so this is Moran's big picture. In real life, it is 8 feet by 12 feet. It is absolutely enormous. And when it was exhibited, people were just amazed, not only by the geological detail, which Hayden actually, sort of consulted with Moran about, but also the amazing color. And you all know, you've been to Yellowstone, you've been to this canyon, the colors really are extraordinary. And it was not like anything that they had ever seen before. So there are figures in the foreground of this painting, which you can't see. This rendering is a little dark on this screen. But on the promontory, you can see 2 figures, and I've kind of blown it up for you here. So this is Hayden, but his back is turned to the viewer, so that photograph didn't really come in handy necessarily. Moran actually had to hire someone else to do the figures because he wasn't very good at painting people. He was only really good at landscapes. And then he positions him beside a figure that is completely fictional, a native person in a dress that is actually more like a plains, more like an Omaha Indian chief instead of someone who would be more appropriate, like a Shoshone or Crow guide from this region. And Moran put him in here because this was also another aspect of much of American landscape painting. You put the single native person in here who's showing the explorer the way and is meant to sort of symbolize the vanishing Indian image. That native people were here, but they're no longer here, and they are making way for white settlement. So Moran was in the middle of painting this, but it was really his watercolors that became important to Hayden in lobbying for the Yellowstone Act. Hayden put together a display, actually, of some specimens that they brought back from Yellowstone, some of Moran's sketches, a couple of Jackson's photographs, and put it in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda to sort of suggest to politicians what was there. So it was a combination of Hayden's writing along with Jackson's photographs and Moran's sketches that helped congressmen really see what a unique and valuable landscape Yellowstone was. But the preservation of Yellowstone was actually not Hayden's idea. That honor belongs to the second of Saving Yellowstone's protagonists, Jay Cook. Cook grew up in Ohio. He started working as a clerk when he was just a teenager, a clerk at a bank. And he was quick with numbers. He really understood business intuitively. And so pretty soon, he was working for an investment bank. And on the eve of the Civil War, he opened his own investment banking company, Jay Cook and Company. During the Civil War, he was appointed to sell bonds to support the U.S. war effort. So basically, he would go out and he would sell bonds in the U.S. government to all manner of people, and they would invest in the nation and provide a lot of money to wage the war. So he became immensely famous for doing this and immensely wealthy. And in the years after the war, he was really kind of searching about for a new project that would give him that same sense of accomplishment and also that same sense of patriotism. Like he wanted to do something for America. And he hit upon the Northern Pacific Railroad, which was a railroad also chartered during the Civil War. It was meant to be completed in 1876, and so it was deemed the Centennial Line. It was going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the country, and it was going to extend from the Great Lakes to the Pacific coast and create another, the second transcontinental line that would connect the country again, but along a different route. So he took control of the fundraising for the Northern Pacific Railroad in 1870. He believed that if he could do this, it would be the grandest achievement of his life. None of his coworkers and his colleagues in the investment banking business could believe that he did this, because railroads were terrible investment. terrible. Because of the nature of the way they are financed, you kind of have to shift money around, right? You can only get money from the government by building the track. But then how do you get the money to build the track? You have to sell bonds in something that doesn't exist yet to people, right? So it was a really hard sell in the years after the war, which were still a little economically precarious. So he was really working hard to bring attention to the Northern Pacific. This is why he was interested in Yellowstone. He wanted to lay that track 50 miles north through what is now Livingston, and he wanted to bring tourist traffic to Yellowstone. So this is why he sent Moran. This is why he kind of notified Hayden and said, you know, if you guys have any information you want to give us about Yellowstone, we'd be happy to hear about it. He also paid lectures. He paid Nathaniel Langford of that 1870 expedition to give talks about Yellowstone and Montana Territory. And he also paid this guy, Pig Iron Kelly, who was a Republican from Pennsylvania, a big railroad advocate, to give a lot of lectures on his behalf in support of the Northern Pacific and the Great Northwest. So he was really determined. He was really obstinate. He thought that with enough advertising and promotion, the Northern Pacific could build its track and be a success. And it was his PR man, A.B. Nettleton, who wrote to Hayden in October of 1871 and gave him the idea for the Yellowstone Act. So basically, this is another letter that I was able to find in my 1 week of research. And Nettleton is basically saying, he says, you know, Judge Kelly had this idea, but really it was Cook. Let Congress pass a bill reserving the Great Geyser Basin as a public park forever, just as it has reserved that far inferior corridor, the Yosemite Valley and the big trees. So already we have some healthy competition between Yellowstone and Yosemite. So this was not Hayden's idea, but he immediately saw the genius of it. And of course was very personally invested, because for him, he thought, yes, if we can preserve particularly the Geyser Basin, which he immediately recognized was probably the largest in the world and the most unique, and he was right about that from the very start. If they could preserve this, then he could keep taking survey expeditions back there. It could become a scientific laboratory for him and for all scientists for all time. So he immediately started lobbying Congress, and again had put up that exhibit of specimens and images from Yellowstone to try and convince congressmen to pass what became known as the Yellowstone Act. So that lobbying effort took place in November and December of 1871. There was a precedent for this. During the Civil War, the U.S. Congress saved Yosemite. But what they had done there is that they gave Yosemite lands to the state of California to manage. The Yellowstone Act would be slightly different. It was going to take land from Wyoming and Idaho and Montana Territory and give it to the federal government to manage. So this was a federal land taking. So again, we have an exertion of federal power in the West and kind of making itself known. So the bill was introduced in both houses in December of 1871. It defined the boundaries of the new national park, about half the size of what it is now, but containing most of its major features, including the Geyser Basin and then ultimately the lower falls and the canyon. Again, took these lands from the territories, gave them to the federal government, and the language was for the benefit and the enjoyment of the people. It was supposed to be a democratic landscape of tourism. So the act was then sent to the bodies Committee on Public Lands, each one, the Senate and the House, for review and recommendation. Then the debates began. So in January and February, we had both the Senate and the House debating the Yellowstone Act. There were two major objections to the act, which are recognizable to us today. One was that this was federal overreach, right? This is the government doing something it had never done before, taking these lands and putting them into public use where they could not be developed in any way. The second objection was that such an act would violate white settler rights which in the West were particularly kind of taken up as an American right, and that both Democrats and Republicans saw this as a huge problem. This was the core of Manifest Destiny. It was the core of the American dream. And so what was going to happen if you took Yellowstone away and you did not let white people settle it? So these were the objections, but Republicans, who were mostly in favor of the Yellowstone Act, still had such a huge majority that the objections did not matter. But it's important to note that the Yellowstone Act was not unanimous. It was bipartisan, but it was not unanimous. 89% of Republicans in the House voted yes. 70% of the Democrats voted no. So, Yellowstone Act is passed and signed by Ulysses S. Grant on March 1st, 1872, but with very little fanfare. It got a lot of coverage in the newspapers, like this piece that was taken from the New York Herald. But, this was not something that everyone just assumed was a really great thing. So this is important to remember. I think now, especially if you watch nature documentaries, it seems like national parks don't have histories. They just emerge kind of whole cloth, as if everyone thinks they're a unambiguously great thing. But there were objections then, and there are objections now. So it is important to remember that. And of course, in this moment, there was also another group of Americans who were not on board with the Yellowstone Act or with any other plans that the U.S. federal government had to take up lands for white settlement in the West. Particularly, and this is the third protagonist of the book, Tatanka Iyotake, Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa Lakota leader, someone who most Americans know about, I think, but don't associate really with Yellowstone. He emerged in the 1860s as a real voice for his people and defense of his homelands, and in this moment became an enemy of Jay Cooke and the Northern Pacific Railroad. Lakota lands in this period extended from the Missouri River to the Yellowstone Basin. They claimed the Yellowstone River as their own and were intent upon pushing all U.S. officials, any white settlers, and the Crow people, who were their traditional enemies, kind of out of those lands. So Sitting Bull was born in the 1830s in the upper Missouri River Valley to a family of war chiefs and community leaders in the Hunkpapa band of the Lakota. He grew up really knowing and accepting that he would be a leader of his people. He was not only a war leader, he was also a diplomat. He was also widely recognized as someone with significant religious visions and power. And it's interesting when you look through the U.S. Congressional Serial Set, which is a digitized collection of all the federal documents from everywhere, all kinds of committee reports, department reports, letters from governors and other civil officials, and you search it for Sitting Bull's name, he just starts to emerge, like in this period. In the late 1860s, early 1870s, everyone starts talking about him. He emerges with Yellowstone kind of in the American imagination as this dominant force in the West. So he consistently asserted his people's rights to their homelands and to their sovereignty. And in the fall of 1871, he really began to push back in a real and successful way, especially against the Northern Pacific Railroad and its U.S. Army details that were protecting them. Whenever they would surveil and spot any Northern Pacific surveyors out in their homelands, they would kind of track them, kind of consider whether or not they wanted to attack them, and then took action. In August of 1872, there were two fights, the Battle of Arrow Creek and also O'Fallon Creek, in which Sitting Bull and his people succeeded in pushing surveyors out of the region. They met them again in their first tangle with George Armstrong Custer in June of 1873. And these were, the fights were not outright victories for the Lakota in a battle sense, but they were able to prevent Jay Cooke and the Northern Pacific Railroad from laying down that track from the Missouri River across to the Yellowstone. And these, I really argue in the book that these engagements, which no one really knows a lot about, these engagements in 1871 and 72 especially, really put Sitting Bull on the road to the Battle of Little Bighorn, to his most spectacular success and his most famous engagement with the U.S. Army. He was also significant because his actions and the actions of his people really delayed and then scuttled the Northern Pacific's plans. And Jay Cooke was never able to actually lay down that track. The Northern Pacific Railroad was not completed until 1883. He just had to kind of give up. Part of the reason that Cooke had to give up is that because he wasn't able to actually lay the track and get any federal funding, he began to loan the Northern Pacific Railroad money from his own investment bank. Those of you who are business majors, have interest in this, know that that is a profoundly bad idea. So his investors in Jay Cooke and Company came calling in September of 1873. He had no money to pay them because he had given it all to the Northern Pacific. His doors closed, and it launched the nation into the Panic and Depression of 1873. So this is how Sitting Bull is related to that larger development. The Lakota, however, were not the only ones in the region who were laying claim to Yellowstone at this moment. This is just a partial map of the tribal nations who had pretty constant interest in and travel through Yellowstone really for hundreds and even thousands of years before Hayden even got there. Yellowstone National Park today has relationships with 27 tribal nations with significant historical connections to the park, and I think is doing a pretty good job in the last couple of years, and then in kind of relationship to the 150th anniversary, to really acknowledge these indigenous connections and a kind of, not really an ownership in the sense that we have of that term, but a kind of claiming of Yellowstone among these groups. And Hayden at one point called Yellowstone the heart of the continent because it gives rise to 3 rivers that then connect to the Missouri, to the Columbia, and the Colorado. And for indigenous peoples, it is also, in many ways, the heart of the continent. So what impact did the Yellowstone Act and Hayden's survey really have? Well, the impact was not immediate. It did not spark an embrace of preservation or conservation. In fact, just a month after passing the Yellowstone Act, Congress passed the General Mining Law, which is still on the books, which permitted and still permits individuals and corporations to prospect on public domain lands and to stake claims in mineral discoveries that they make there. So obviously, this is not a linear move in the direction of preservation. Congress did not provide much funding for infrastructure in the park for the first decade. It was still difficult to get there until 1833, when the Northern Pacific was completed. And finally, Cooke actually did live to see his initial vision brought to fruition because it did bring many more tourists to the region. In the first 10 years, there were really only 500 to 1,000 visitors annually to Yellowstone. Congress did not pass any other major preservation legislation until 1890, and when they created Yosemite and Sequoia and General Grant National Parks. And then, of course, it took the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt after the turn of the century to really make major strides in federal preservation, mostly due to the 1906 Antiquities Act. So ultimately, Yellowstone did not, it didn't have an immediate impact, but it did set the precedent for the creation of national parks and their management under the federal government, the Department of the Interior. It also kind of fulfilled Hayden's dream. Because Yellowstone was preserved and such a huge amount of land was preserved, the federal government then was able to create national forests all around it, the Custer Gallatin and the Shoshone. And this has created one of the only intact temperate zones in the world. And because of that, it has drawn scientists to it. And many scientists today are doing a lot of climate change research and other forms of research in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem because of this initial act of preservation. So Saving Yellowstone tells the stories of the exploration and the preservation of this iconic landscape through the experiences of Ferdinand Hayden and Jay Cook and Sitting Bull. And through them, and through looking at reconstruction from Yellowstone, and Yellowstone in the context of reconstruction, I think this really allows us to see a couple of things. First of all, that reconstruction was a political and an economic and a social project focused not only on the South, but also on the West. The West is part of that larger story. It was an effort on the part of the federal government to unite the country from coast to coast through a variety of projects, including the exploration and the preservation of Yellowstone. It also shows us that 1871 to 72 was a moment in which the government was really reaching for something higher, before, unfortunately, abandoning it soon afterwards. Politicians would not use federal supremacy to protect Black civil rights again for almost a century. And as I just noted, Congress did not create any more substantial national parks for several decades. Seeing reconstruction from Yellowstone also allows us to see how the effort to explore and preserve Yellowstone rested on native land dispossession. But that indigenous peoples fought this effort every step of the line, and that they survived and they persisted and they continue to defend their lands against commercial and federal encroachment in this region. And finally, I think this angle of vision really reveals that Yellowstone itself was not only the world's first national park, but also a perfect metaphor for the country at this moment in the mid-1870s. It was a place that was both awe-inspiring and dangerous, a nation that was both fragile and powerful, and a place where what lies just beneath the surface is always threatening to explode. And this is what we call hard history, right? It is not meant to undermine or contradict the love that we have for places like Yellowstone or our wonder at their beauty. Instead, I think it is really necessary that all Americans understand this kind of hard history in order to appreciate the beauty of these places and to understand the fullness, particularly of Yellowstone's past and present. Thank you.